"You're just here for the pictures, Grandma," she said, already turning her back. As if I were nothing more than a dusty prop in the family album. The words didn't hit me at first. I was still holding the dish towel, half lifted to dry a plate I hadn't yet been asked to wash. Her voice was light, dismissive, like I'd offered something so far outside the realm of usefulness, it had to be swatted away before it embarrassed us both. Eva didn't even wait for a reply. She was too busy posing with her mother in front of the fireplace, lips puckered, eyes bright with the kind of youth that assumes it invented beauty. I lowered the towel, folded it gently, and placed it by the sink. Around me, the house hummed with Christmas cheer, tinkling laughter, the rustle of wrapping paper, and the low drone of some saccharine holiday song that had played 3 times already. I watched my son Robert refill his wine glass without offering to top off mine. I watched my daughter-in-law arrange hors d'oeuvres with the precision of someone hosting for social media rather than family. I watched myself vanish. No one noticed when I sat down. I chose the small armchair in the corner, the one just close enough to the fire to warm my knees, but tucked far enough away that no one would feel obligated to include me in their conversations. I sipped my wine. It had gone warm and sour. They talked about renovations, new diets, Eva's graduate program, her thesis on generational trauma. What a laugh. She hadn't even bothered to ask me about mine. "Mom, did you bring the photo album?" Robert called out absently. "Yes," I replied, but he was already halfway through another story. About work. About himself. The album sat in my lap like an anchor, thick leather-bound with cracked edges and pages that smelled of smoke and time. It was filled with things I thought mattered once. Wedding pictures, babies in bathtubs, my late husband George in uniform, his smile crooked from holding in a laugh. They only looked at it when they needed proof of something. Who had worn that dress first? What year we visited the lake? I was the keeper of trivia, not memory. Eva passed by me again, holding her phone aloft like a torch in a cave of nostalgia. "You know," she said without looking up, "those war stories might have been cool once, but they're kinda repetitive now." Repetitive. As if watching men die of fever in bamboo tents, as if burying children in soil that didn't belong to them, was a bedtime story I insisted on telling too many times. I didn't reply. I didn't trust my voice to hold. Instead, I traced my fingers along the spine of the album and opened it to a page I hadn't looked at in years. There we were, George and I, in a tent lit by a hurricane lamp. He was reading a book, shirt open to the heat, and I was scribbling in my journal, legs tucked under me, face still flushed from tree of. We looked happy, tired, but whole. I'd forgotten that version of us. No one here had ever known it. After dinner, they gathered for photos. I stood in the back, smiling the way I'd trained myself to, pleasant, neutral, forgettable. Eva took 10 shots and didn't once turn the camera toward me unless I was part of the background. Later, when the wrapping paper was cleared and the house quieted to the ticking of the grandfather clock, I wandered upstairs and into the spare room they called mine. It smelled like lavender sachets and unused linens. I sat at the small desk, still in my holiday sweater, and opened the bottom drawer. The box was there. I hadn't touched it in years. Inside were pieces of myself they didn't know existed. Letters I'd written and never sent. Maps from places I was forbidden to talk about. Photographs too raw for frames. There was a medical report with my signature scrawled across the bottom, written during a cholera outbreak in '62. There was a telegram from George, the last one he'd sent before his unit moved and the world shifted under our feet. I took out a legal pad and uncapped my pen. At first, the ink resisted, dry from time. I pressed harder until it flowed. I didn't write to anyone. Not really. Not to Eva or Robert or even George. I wrote to myself. "You are not invisible," I began. "You are not a relic. You are the result of wars survived, of bodies healed, of love buried and never mourned aloud." The words came slowly at first, then faster, jagged, heavy. I didn't cry, not exactly. But my throat ached, and my hands trembled the way they did when George first left for the front. I wrote about the things I remembered, not because they were grand, but because they were mine. I wrote about the little Cambodian girl who died holding my hand, About the priest who blessed me after I stitched his broken ribs. About how quiet the jungle became after the rain. By the time I finished, dawn was brushing the horizon. Pale pink light filtered through the blinds, and the silence had shifted, from hollow to whole. I folded the letter, pressed it into the box, and closed the lid. Downstairs, the coffee maker clicked on. I heard the clatter of Robert's dress shoes, always too formal for mornings. The house would wake soon, filled again with cheerful tones and curated conversations. But something in me had already changed. I would not beg to be heard anymore. I would make them listen. I had meant to throw it away. The letter had been folded and refolded so many times, the creases had thinned into translucent veins across the paper. I found it tucked between old tax forms and yellowing warranty cards in the filing cabinet George insisted we keep. The handwriting startled me. It was mine, but from another time. Sharper. Angrier. Maybe braver. It began with no greeting. No dear Elaine. No softened entry. Just a sentence, raw and deliberate. I am not who you said I was. I sat at the kitchen table, the early sun warming the worn wood, and read the letter in full for the first time since writing it over 20 years ago. The ink had bled slightly, just enough to betray the tears I'd dropped on it back then. I didn't remember crying. Back then, I'd written the letter after Elaine slammed the door and called me suffocating. That word echoed louder than any curse would have. Not just because she said it, but because it echoed something I'd always feared. That my efforts to hold our broken world together had become the very reason she wanted out of it. The letter was full of memories, accusations, truths. It detailed George's death. How he walked into the hospital with a fever and never walked out. How I, a nurse, had felt the wrongness immediately. How I'd asked for tests, for a specialist, only to be told I was emotional. His appendix ruptured before the second shift change. The infection took him in 3 days. I still remember the exact time I stopped hearing his breathing. Elaine had only been 15. Robert was 12. I didn't cry at the funeral. I couldn't afford to. I spent the next 15 years trying to be enough for them, and apparently, in trying, I became too much. I reread the part of the letter where I confessed how scared I'd been every day. That they'd fall apart, that I would. That if I ever stopped moving, something would collapse. I told her how every meal cooked, every curfew enforced, every late shift taken at the hospital was not control. It was survival. It was all I knew. But daughters rarely see the mother behind the mothering. Elaine once asked me, casually as she rinsed a plate, why I never dated again. I said something trite about not finding the right person. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that I had already loved through fire. Through illness, death, war. I had loved men who bled in my lap and called for their mothers with their final breath. I had loved George through every hospital corridor and graveside whisper. After that, anything less than that kind of devotion felt hollow. I didn't have space for a second beginning, and I didn't want one. But I never said that to her. I suppose we both held back in our own ways. I set the letter down and made myself a cup of tea. Chamomile. I never liked it, but I drink it now for the comfort it promises. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the cup, more from memory than age. Steam rose, blurring the edges of the room, softening the harshness of morning. I looked around at the walls filled with framed pictures, birthdays, graduations, Christmases. Every photo carefully posed. Smiling faces arranged like evidence of a life well lived. Yet none of them showed the part where I was stitching uniforms by candlelight, or soothing dying strangers with words I made up on the spot just to ease their fear. No photo ever captured the part where I grieved alone in the kitchen, after the children were asleep, hands raw from dishwater, heart aching for someone to say, "You're doing fine, Ruth." No one ever said it. Not even me. I glanced back at the letter. In one paragraph I had written, I gave up more than just comfort. I gave up being known. I don't know why that line made me stand. Maybe it was the sharpness of its truth. I walked to the hallway closet, pulled out a battered box labeled Wills and Estate, and sat down with it on the floor. There I kept the draft of my will, basic, efficient, emotionless. Assets divided, instructions outlined. But nothing of me was in it. I took the letter, unfolded it one more time, and added a new line at the bottom, in my current hand. I never stopped loving you, Elaine. I just stopped trying to explain myself. Then I refolded it, placed it inside a new envelope and labeled it for my daughter, when she's ready. I set the envelope beside the will. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean, quiet, like a drawer finally closed. Afterward, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself, not out of vanity, but curiosity. I saw the grooves at the corners of my mouth, the softened chin, the silver hair I still tried to style every morning. My face had aged, yes, but it hadn't disappeared. There was still something fierce behind my eyes. I turned on the printer and printed a fresh copy of the letter. I wrote another for Robert, different in tone, and one more for Eva, short, simple. Not explanations, not apologies, just pieces of me. Pieces they could hold when the day came that they wanted more than just the pictures. That night, as I tucked the letters back into the box and closed the lid, I didn't feel peace exactly, but I felt present. And that was enough to carry me into tomorrow. The attic smelled of cedar and dust and forgotten years. I hadn't climbed those narrow steps in over a decade. My knees complained with every creak of the wooden ladder, but I pressed on, one hand gripping the railing, the other clutching the flashlight like a talisman. The beam danced across cardboard boxes and plastic bins labeled in George's careful print. Christmas ornaments, camping gear, baby clothes. All the usual ghosts. The box I was looking for wasn't labeled. I knew exactly where it sat. Behind the stack of winter coats no one wore anymore, next to the metal trunk full of George's old records. A weathered leather case with rusting buckles. I reached for it with both hands and pulled it toward me, heart thudding. Not from exertion, but from memory. I unfastened the latches and there it was. My war journal. A black notebook with a cracked spine and pages so thin they fluttered when I breathed on them. I ran my fingers over the cover, tracing the faded initials I'd once carved with the tip of a scalpel. RLW, Ruth Lillian Winters. Before I became mom. Before grandma. Before I was anyone's anything. I opened the journal and was instantly transported. May 14, 1958. Sierra Leone. One child died today. Another lives. The line between the two was a timing of minutes and a clean needle. Caleb says we did what we could, but I saw his hands shake when he buried the first girl. It never gets easier. I don't want it to. I sat back against an old trunk and let the attic fade around me. The heat came first, wet and thick, the kind that made your clothes cling to your skin like guilt. I remembered the heavy canvas tents, the buzz of flies, the scent of antiseptic barely covering the stench of infection. We worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, sweating through uniforms stained with red dust and blood. The locals called me Mama Bone because I was so thin back then, all elbows and resolve. And Caleb. He came into the camp 6 weeks after me, fresh from medical school and still wearing polished shoes. The locals called him Dr. White Shoes, at first as a joke, later with affection. He had the kind of face that looked like it belonged in a painting. Clean lines, soft eyes, but what stayed with me was his laugh. It was rare, but when it came, it cracked through the air like relief. He was engaged to someone back in Oxford. He didn't talk about her much. I never asked. What we had wasn't a romance in the traditional sense. It was survival made beautiful. We stitched wounds side by side, passed notes in supply crates, whispered philosophy under mosquito nets. One night, during a monsoon, when the camp flooded and the generators failed, he took my hand and kissed the inside of my wrist like it was sacred. We made a promise that night, nothing dramatic. Just a promise to meet again, someday, when the world was less on fire. That day never came. He died the following spring, caught in an ambush on a supply run. The Red Cross sent me a telegram that began with "We regret to inform you." I tore it in half and buried it under a tree near the clinic. I left 2 weeks later, transferred to Cambodia. I never told anyone about him. Not George. Not Elaine or Robert. Not even my sister. It wasn't shame. It was preservation. Caleb wasn't just a man I loved. He was a part of me that existed in a time no one ever asked about. I thumbed through the journal slowly, letting the memories rise and settle like dust in the attic air. Clipped inside were Polaroids, children wrapped in threadbare blankets, a man holding his wife's hand after surgery, a blurry image of me with my sleeves rolled up and mud on my cheeks, laughing at something Caleb had said. Tucked in the back cover was the bronze medal. It was small, unimpressive to look at. Just a dull disc with an engraving of two hands clasped over a globe. The inscription read, "For humanitarian valor beyond borders." I had received it in 1962, from an international medical organization. George had known about the ceremony but couldn't attend. He'd already started at the firm, and I was weeks pregnant with Elaine. Life moved fast after that. The medal went into the box. So did the journal. So did Ruth. I looked across the attic toward the open hatch where light filtered in from below. My family knew none of this. Not the children, not the outbreaks, not the languages I learned well enough to comfort the dying. Not Caleb. And yet they called me strong. They called me resilient. But they didn't know why. I stood up slowly, joints cracking, and carried the journal and medal downstairs. In the living room, family photos lined the mantel: Elaine's wedding, Robert's promotion, Eva as a toddler dressed as a sunflower. I stared at them, then at the journal in my hands. These pictures, these lives, grew from soil I tended alone for years. And they had no idea. I sat at the kitchen table, journal beside me, and stared out the window. A bluebird landed on the fence, looked around nervously, and took flight again. I envied its freedom, and its silence. I thought of Eva, with her biting sarcasm and impatient sighs. I thought of Elaine, so tightly wound in her own bitterness she couldn't see mine. I thought of Robert, kind but oblivious, always too quick to reassure without listening. They didn't ask because they didn't want to know. And I didn't tell them because I wanted to be wanted for who I had become, not who I had been. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe the mistake wasn't in hiding my past, but in assuming no one would care if I shared it. I reached for a blank note card from the drawer and wrote, "Ask me about Caleb sometime." I left it unaddressed. Not as a confrontation, as an invitation. Then I picked up the journal again and began reading, this time aloud to the empty room, my voice shaking but clear. The words were still mine, and I wasn't going to let them die in a box no one ever asked about. I didn't want applause. I wanted air. After weeks of thumbing through old journals, tracing the lines of my own forgotten handwriting, and sitting in rooms crowded with my silence, I realized something simple but profound. No one could carry my story if I didn't first speak it out loud. So I walked to the library. Not the large downtown one, too impersonal, too much echo. The little branch tucked between the flower shop and the pharmacy, with creaky floors and mismatched chairs. The kind of place that still smelled faintly of paper and binding glue. A teenager at the front desk barely looked up. "Can I help you?" I hesitated, fingers wrapped around the leather strap of my purse. "I'd like to reserve one of your community rooms. For a small event." Her fingers danced across the keyboard. "What kind of event?" "A storytelling," I said. "Historical, in a way. Personal, too." She nodded. "We've got the Birch Room available next Thursday evening. Seats 20. Projector works. You need tech help?" "I might," I said. "I've never done anything like this." That was an understatement. I hadn't stood in front of a group since George's memorial. And I hadn't told my own story to anyone, ever. I went home and drafted the flyer in large font on my computer. Unsung stories. One woman's forgotten history. Thursday 6 p.m. Birch Room Community Library. No name. No RSVP. Just an offering. I printed 15 copies and walked them back to the library, pinning one to the corkboard by the entrance. Another went to the coffee shop bulletin. One I slid into the elevator at the senior center. I didn't know what I expected. That night, while the house lay quiet and still, I sat at the dining room table with my war journal, a scanner, and my laptop. I clicked through old photographs, selected 10. Caleb smiling over a surgical tray. A barefoot child clutching my hand. A floodline marked with chalk on a collapsing wall. I added captions. I recorded myself practicing each section. Awkward, slow, halting. I edited it down. By the second day, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept playing each word I might say, judging every pause. Then came Marisol. She was the young librarian who managed the Birch Room Tech. She met me an hour before my practice run, wearing black-rimmed glasses and a t-shirt that read, "Librarians are rebels with reading glasses." "Need help setting up?" she asked gently. "Very much." I expected her to treat me like some fussy old woman with a slideshow. But she listened as I explained the sequence, how I wanted to read from my journal between slides, how the photos needed to fade in softly. "No problem," she said. "Want to try it out?" And so we did. I stood behind the podium. My hands shook. My throat dried. Marisol sat in the first row, alone, holding a notebook and pen. Not out of duty, she was listening. I began. Not with Caleb. Not with death. But with life. "Before I was a mother," I said. "Before I was anyone's wife or anyone's grandma. I was a field nurse. I traveled to 5 countries in 7 years. I delivered babies in bamboo huts. I stitched machete wounds by candlelight. I fell in love and I lost everything. But I never stopped being me." I looked up. Marisol wasn't scribbling. She was crying. Later she stood and said, "That was extraordinary." I blinked, taken off guard. "Really? More than that," she said. "It felt sacred." I hadn't expected that word. It stuck with me for days. On Thursday evening, I arrived early, wearing a soft gray sweater, and the brooch George gave me on our 10th anniversary. I had printed copies of one of my journal entries for anyone who might want to take it home. By 6 o'clock the room wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. 10 people sat in the folding chairs, some older, some younger. A woman with a baby in a sling. A man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. A teenage boy fidgeting with his phone. And then, Eva. She slipped in just as I adjusted the microphone. She didn't greet me. Didn't sit up front. Just slid quietly into the last row, her coat still on, her arms crossed. I nearly stopped breathing. But I didn't. I looked at her. And I began. "My name," I said, "is Ruth Lillian Winters. I was born during a war, came of age in another, and have lived most of my life feeling like a footnote in someone else's story. But tonight, I'm reading my own pages." The first slide lit the screen. A child with bandages on her legs, smiling through cracked lips. The room was still. I read. I shared. I didn't hold back. I told them about Caleb, though not by name. I spoke of grief, of resilience, of standing in rivers to wash blood from my skirts. I recited the last line of a poem I wrote after my first patient died. She left in silence, but her breath still echoed in my hands. No one looked away. And Eva looked stunned. When I finished, I closed the journal gently and said, "Thank you." Marisol clapped first. Then the others. The man with tired eyes stood. The woman with the baby reached out for a handout. A few people came up to me, said kind things, asked soft questions. But Eva said nothing. She walked out as quietly as she'd come. Still, I had seen her face. And that was more than I expected. That night, alone again at my table, I didn't feel invisible. I felt heard. Silence, I've learned, has many tones. There's the silence of a fever breaking, the body exhaling what it barely survived. There's the silence of a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, when machines beep softly and prayers are mouthed, not spoken. And then there's the silence that follows your story being laid bare, fragile, trembling, and whole, before people who don't know what to say. This was that silence. The projector hummed its low, final note. My closing words still echoed faintly in my ears. I am not a memory. I am still here. The room was still. My hands rested gently on the war journal I had closed with intention, like a book returned to its shelf after years of dust. The clapping came slowly, respectfully. Not the applause of entertainment, but of recognition. Of something shared. Marisol reached me first. Her arms wrapped around me before I could prepare for it. Ruth, that was everything, she whispered. You don't even know. I held her longer than I meant to. Then others approached, an older woman who gripped my wrist and said, "You reminded me of my mother." a young man with nervous energy, who asked if I'd ever considered turning my journal into a book. I smiled, said thank you, shook hands I would forget and faces I would remember. And then I noticed the chair in the back. Empty. Eva was gone. She hadn't said a word. Not even a glance. She had sat through the entire hour, still as a stone, and then disappeared without acknowledgement. No gesture, no smile, no movement that might signal understanding, even curiosity. A small part of me had hoped. Naively, I now realize that she would approach me afterward. Ask something. Anything. Even a snide remark would have been a kind of engagement. Instead, she left a hollow space where something might have begun. Marisol helped me pack up the slides. We didn't speak much. She sensed something had shifted in me. A bruise I hadn't shown before. When I got home, the house felt quieter than usual. Not just empty, hollow. My shoes echoed in the hallway. I placed the journal on my desk like a sacred object, careful not to disturb the paper clips or creased photos tucked inside. I made tea but forgot to drink it. I stood by the window for what felt like hours, watching nothing in particular, waiting for a feeling I couldn't name. Then just before midnight I heard it. The soft sound of paper sliding under the door. I walked slowly, pulse ticking in my ears. On the floor sat a single sheet of folded notebook paper. No envelope. No adornment. Just a simple fold and handwriting I hadn't seen in years, but recognized instantly. Eva's. I crouched down, knees popping, and picked it up with both hands, as though it might vanish if I were careless. The note read, I didn't know. I'm sorry, Eva. Nothing else. No explanations. No excuses. No pleading. Just 7 words. But they landed heavier than applause. I sat down on the bottom step and stared at them for a long while. Part of me ached for more. For a conversation, a coffee, a tearful embrace like in the movies. But life rarely offers such scripts. Still, those words were something. A crack in the wall. I brought the note to the kitchen, placed it on the table, and stared at it as I pulled out a sheet of stationery. I didn't want to lash out. I didn't want to explain everything all over again. But I needed to respond. Not to validate her guilt, but to affirm my own worth. I wrote, Thank you for your note. I understand that there's a great deal we've both left unsaid over the years. You don't owe me a performance. And I don't owe anyone the erasure of my life. I shared what I did because it's mine to share. Not for pity. Not for praise. Just to remind the world, and perhaps myself, that I existed long before I became a name in someone else's phone contacts. If you ever want to know more, I'll be here. But not as a relic. As a person. Grandma Ruth. I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and wrote her name on the front in clean, deliberate cursive. The next morning, I left it at her door, wedged just beneath the edge of her doormat. I didn't knock. I didn't linger. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to be myself. That day passed gently. I baked a lemon loaf. I tended to the garden, trimming the wilting petals off my chrysanthemums. I reread my old poems. Some were terrible, others aching with truth. I wore my softest cardigan and sat by the window as evening folded over the sky. Eva didn't reply that day, or the next. But something inside me had already shifted. The silence between us now wasn't empty, it was open. Not a wall. A doorway. And I, for once, didn't feel the need to knock first. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Not from weight, but from meaning. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the quiet hush of late afternoon, and uncapped the blue ink pen I'd always saved for formal letters. The good one. The one George used when he signed the papers for our house. The one I used when writing my final resignation letter to the hospital. Funny how objects absorb gravity with time. The document before me was the draft of my will, typed, sterile legal. All neat bullet points and impersonal phrasing. To be divided equally per the executor's discretion, as specified in Appendix A. But now I was ready to rewrite it. Not out of bitterness, but precision. I wanted it to speak. I pulled the fresh legal pad toward me and began writing longhand. My hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from the sharpness of decision. This wasn't a goodbye. It was a reclamation. I started with the journal. To the University Medical Archives at St. Bartholomew's. My war journal, field notes, and photographs from my years abroad, under the condition that they be preserved as primary documents of female medical aid during international conflicts. Let them be seen. Let them be studied. I paused. That journal had lived in silence for too long. Now it would outlive me. Next, the bronze medal. To Lily, my youngest granddaughter, who does not yet know this side of me, but whose eyes are wide with wonder, I leave the bronze humanitarian medal. It's not shiny or impressive, but it came from courage. May she learn from that, not from its weight, but from its story. I smiled faintly. Lily had once asked me what my special job had been. I told her I was a helper. She said she wanted to be one too. That was enough. Then I turned to the poems. To Marisol, who listened without obligation and made space where none was asked. I leave my handwritten poetry notebooks, with permission to publish any piece she finds worthy. Thank you for seeing me. The tears crept up then, soft and sudden. I hadn't expected them, but I didn't fight them either. They came not from sadness, but release. For years, my life had been distilled into casserole recipes, birthday cards, and the occasional, "Thank you for babysitting, Mom." All of it well-meaning. All of it incomplete. I folded my hands and let the silence wash over me. No part of this process was angry. I wasn't cutting anyone out. But I was done pretending that my life had been decorative, that it fit neatly into the corner frames of my children's timelines. I added more. To Elaine and Robert, my children, I leave equal shares of my estate, as originally intended. But with them, I now include letters, handwritten and sealed, each containing truths I never voiced aloud. Read them when you're ready, not before. And if you never are, that's your burden, not mine. To their children I gave books. Real ones. Well-loved copies of The Prophet, Jane Eyre, and All Quiet on the Western Front. Each with margin notes from my younger self. I wanted them to know what shaped me before I was the woman who made their sandwiches and sewed their Halloween costumes. I paused to stretch my fingers. The light outside was dimming, casting amber over the countertop. My teacup had gone cold. With slow care, I placed each handwritten page into a fresh folder labeled Final Will, Personal Addendum. I tucked in the sealed letters, the list of bequests, and the notes on each item's significance. I wrote a cover letter in large, clean cursive, for when you're ready to know who I truly was. I didn't sign it with love. Not because love wasn't there, but because this was about truth, not sentiment. I'd done my loving in casseroles and lullabies and sleepless nights. This was about voice. I folded everything with care, slid the documents into cream-colored envelopes, and wrote each recipient's name in full. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked them to the mailbox myself. One by one, I slipped the envelopes inside. With each, I whispered a small benediction, not aloud but quietly, like a mother watching her child leave home. Not every recipient would welcome these words. But I didn't write them for comfort. I wrote them for the record. That evening, I returned to the living room and lit a single candle. The shadows flickered against the walls, and I sat down beside the fireplace, holding a photo of George. "You'd have liked this part," I whispered. Me finally getting loud. He'd always said I played small to keep the peace. I used to tell him that peace was worth the price. Now I'm not so sure. I watched the candle flame bend and straighten, over and over, like breath. A reminder that even in stillness, there is motion. The will was no longer just a formality. It was a map of a woman no one thought to ask about. But one day they would read. And when they did, they wouldn't just find assets or heirlooms. They'd find me. The days passed like softened stones, unremarkable but smooth in the hand. I tended to my garden in the early mornings, pruning the rosemary bush back to shape, coaxing the peonies into bloom. I went to book club on Thursdays, even if I didn't always finish the books. I began baking again, simple things, lemon bread, cranberry scones. Enough to fill the house with the warm smell of something living. I didn't hear from anyone right away. The envelopes I had sent were received, I knew. I had tracked them, Something George used to tease me about, my need for confirmation. But there were no replies. No phone calls. No emails. And I was okay. The silence no longer felt like erasure. It felt like pause. And I had stopped needing to fill every pause with apology. Then on a Tuesday afternoon the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I was elbow deep in flour and molasses, trying to resurrect an old ginger cookie recipe I used to make with my mother. But something about the ring, sharp, insistent, nudged me. Hello. A soft voice crackled through the receiver. Mrs. Winters? Yes. My name is Daniel Rourke. I'm an English teacher at Winston High School. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel. How can I help? Well, he began tentative. I read about your talk at the library in the Gazette. A few of our students are doing a unit on personal history and unsung voices. I was wondering, would you be willing to speak to one of our classes? I didn't answer right away. The old me would have said no before he finished the sentence. The one who worried about wasting people's time, or sounding silly, or being too much. But the woman I was becoming, rediscovering, she took a moment to consider. How many students? 22. Mostly juniors. Good kids. Some are better listeners than others, he chuckled. But they're curious. And they've never heard from someone like you. Someone like me. I smiled. Yes, I said. I'd be honored. He sounded surprised. Grateful. We arranged a date for the following week. As I hung up the phone, I felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest, something warm and light. That same evening, my landline rang again. I nearly laughed. 2 calls in one day felt like divine mischief. I answered. Mom. Elaine's voice. Tighter. Older. But still hers. I got your letter, she said, then paused. I read it twice. I held the receiver like it might bite me. And? I didn't know, Mom, she said, softer. I didn't know about the camps. About the medal. About any of it. That's why I wrote it, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'm not calling to argue, she added quickly. I just wanted to ask a few things. If that's okay. Go ahead. And so she asked. About my first night in Sierra Leone. About how I learned to sterilize instruments without electricity. About the girl with the fever who died in my lap. She asked if I had loved George when we married. I said yes, and I meant it. She didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to. We talked for just under an hour. Her voice softened by the end, asking more gently, even laughing once. Not a full laugh, just the glimmer of one. When we hung up, I placed the phone gently on its base, my hands still steady. It wasn't healing. Not yet. But it was something. A bridge with no railings. A beginning. 3 days later, Eva called. Grandma, she said, her voice catching. Can I ask you something kind of personal? Yes. Was Caleb real? I sat down. Yes, I said. He was. I found the note, she whispered. The one you left in the attic box. You said, ask me about Caleb sometime. So, I muskin. And so I told her. About his hands. His stubbornness. The way he laughed only when he meant it. How he bandaged wounds while humming old jazz tunes. How he died in a place where help was never going to reach him in time. I told her I never told anyone about him because sometimes you protect the things that mattered most by keeping them sacred. She cried. Not loudly. Just soft breaths turned shaky. I didn't offer comfort. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd learned something about grief. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is not rush to make someone feel better. Thank you, she said at last, for trusting me. I didn't at first, I admitted. But I do now. That night, I stood by the window again, watching the stars blink into place like secrets finally surfacing. The door was open. But this time, I wasn't standing in the frame waiting to be invited in. I was already whole. I wasn't expecting anyone to remember. Birthdays, once you pass a certain age, become quiet things. A cup of tea instead of champagne. A warm robe instead of wrapped boxes. I had already started the morning with a walk around the garden, pulling a few weeds with gloved hands, watching the lavender catch the breeze. I hadn't planned anything. I didn't want to. But at noon the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Robert, Elaine and Eva, all standing on the porch. No balloons. No shouting. Just them, holding a wide flat box, ribboned in deep blue. "Happy birthday, Mom," Robert said gently, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. Elaine followed, quieter, her hug a little longer than I expected. And Eva last looked me in the eyes when she said, "This is for you." The box was heavier than it looked. I carried it into the living room and set it on the coffee table, the three of them following behind. They didn't sit until I gestured. "What is it?" I asked, already sensing the care in their silence. Eva smiled. "We made something. Together." I undid the ribbon, lifted the lid, and gasped. It was an album. Not the old one with birthdays and backyard barbecues. This one had a black linen cover, smooth and matte, with gold lettering stamped in the center. The Life of Ruth Lillian Winters. I opened to the first page. A photo of me, age 24, sitting cross-legged outside a field hospital tent. My hair tied up in a scarf, a stethoscope around my neck, hands bandaged from hours of work. I hadn't even remembered this picture existed. Below it, a caption in Eva's handwriting. Before she was ours, she was her own. The next page held a clipping of my article in the Red Cross Field Bulletin, yellowed but cleanly preserved. Next to it, Elaine had written in careful, slanted script. "I never knew how much courage could fit in a single life. Now I do." I turned the pages slowly, each one filled with fragments I thought long buried. Photos from Cambodia, scraps of maps, scanned journal pages. There was even the award letter for my humanitarian medal, pressed neatly under protective film. But more than the documents, it was the notes that stopped me. Robert had written beside a photo of me holding a feverish child. "I understand now why you were always so careful. You saved people. You were trying to save us too." Marisol had added a page, photocopies of my poetry, surrounded by her notes in the margins. Her words made space for mine. That's what true writers do. Each child, each grandchild had added a page. Lily had drawn a picture of me in my nurse's uniform and written in purple marker, "My grandma is a hero. I'm going to be one too." I had to pause then. My hand hovered over the next page, breath catching in my throat. They let me. No one rushed me. No one filled the space with nervous laughter, or turned on the TV or said, "Don't cry." They just sat. Still. Present. And that was what undid me. Not the gift, as precious as it was, but the silence. The listening. The reverence of being seen not as someone aging out of relevance, but someone with a story that shaped theirs. I closed the album slowly, my hands trembling just a little. "Thank you," I said, my voice thin but steady, "for remembering me. Even the parts you never knew." Eva reached for my hand. "We're still learning," she said. "But we're ready now." And maybe they were. Not ready in the way children are ready to shoulder a parent's history, but ready in the way people begin to make room for complexity, for nuance, for grace. We sat together for a while longer, not filling the room with noise, just being. I served tea. We shared scones. Elaine asked if I still had the uniform. I nodded. She said she'd like to see it someday. Robert said he wanted to read more of my poetry. Nothing dramatic. No speeches. Just the quiet work of mending. That night, I placed the album on my bedside table. I didn't want it shelved away, not yet. I wanted to look at it again in the morning. To remember that history isn't just kept. It's shared. And finally, they were reaching for it. For me. The garden was in full bloom. Lavender spilled over the edge of the path in soft, fragrant waves. Bees hummed lazily between the basil and the marigolds. And the sun set just right, low and golden, casting gentle light on everything it touched. I sat in my favorite chair beneath the oak, wrapped in a shawl more out of habit than necessity. The breeze was warm. The world was quiet. In my lap rested a brand new notebook, linen cover, blank pages, untouched spine. The kind you save for beginnings, not endings. My hands moved slowly now. Age has its own pace. But there was no urgency left in me. No need to finish something before the world turned its head. Today, I wasn't writing for proof. I wasn't writing to be remembered. I was writing because the voice inside me still lived. I uncapped my pen, the same blue ink fountain pen I'd used to sign my new will, and let the tip hover above the first line. But I didn't write. Not yet. Instead, I looked up at the garden, really looked. The way I used to in the early days, when George and I first moved here. When the kids were young and the soil was fresh and untouched. I could still see him sometimes in the way the mint refused to stay where I planted it. In the trellis he built, slightly crooked but standing strong. The way love ages, really, bent, weathered, but still holding everything up. I closed my eyes. There had been so much silence in my life. The kind that wraps around you in crowded rooms, when everyone is laughing but no one sees you. The kind that builds like sediment, layer by layer, until you forget the sound of your own voice. I had been the keeper of stories, the cook of meals, the organizer of birthdays and holidays and lives. My name was etched on thank you cards and listed in the footnotes of family albums. But for years I wasn't seen. Not really. And for a long time, I thought that was what aging meant. Fading out. Becoming less. Being spoken about, but rarely to. I had been angry. Quietly. Resentfully. I had folded that anger into politeness, into helpfulness, into keeping the peace. But then something shifted. And I shifted with it. I didn't need a stage. I just needed a room. I didn't need applause. I needed attention. The true kind. The kind that listens, not just hears. That sees, not just looks. Now they knew. Not everything. But enough. Elaine hadn't called again, not yet. But I knew she was thinking. That was enough. Robert had stopped by last week with a folder of my poems printed and bound in plastic sleeves. He didn't say much, just, "I've been reading." That was enough. And Eva, well, Eva had started asking questions. The real kind. About choices. About Caleb. About why I stayed after George died and didn't move in with one of them. I told her the truth. Because I didn't want to disappear completely. She nodded. I think she understood. I opened the notebook and finally wrote the date at the top of the first page. April 14th. My 83rd birthday. I tapped the pen once against the margin, and then began to write. This is not a final entry. It's simply another chapter. Today I planted 3 new rose bushes, each one a different shade. I wanted them to clash. Too many things in life are forced to match. Let them bloom in chaos. I paused. A butterfly flitted past, golden and thin-winged, landing briefly on the rim of my teacup. I smiled. I wrote more. I've spent a lifetime tending to others. And for the most part, I don't regret it. But I've learned that tending is not the same as giving yourself away. You can water other people's gardens, but you must plant your own. I wish someone had told me that sooner. But maybe I wouldn't have heard it back then. I flipped the page and kept going. Memories came easily now. The sound of laughter in a tent after surgery. The feel of a child's fevered forehead. The silence of loss. The strange joy of showing up, over and over. Even when no one asks you to. Not for them. Not anymore. For me. For the voice I had buried under duty and folded laundry and silent dinners. For the girl I had once been. And the woman I had fought to reclaim. The sun dipped lower in the sky, throwing amber across the hydrangeas. I leaned back in my chair, and let the pen fall gently into my lap. I wasn't waiting for anything. Not for reconciliation. Not for recognition. I had already found what I needed. The voice I thought I had lost, muted, muffled, shaped into someone else's version of womanhood, had never left. It had only gone quiet. But I had spoken now. And been heard. I closed the notebook, my fingers brushing the cover with care. I knew I would write again tomorrow. And the next day. Not to leave something behind, but simply to keep going. As I watched the last of the sunlight catch on the rim of the garden stones, I whispered, only to myself, only once. They don't need to remember everything I lived through. I do. And that is enough.